What is linked open data? Let me explain with some Tolkien-related examples. Consider the following statements. Bilbo is a hobbit. Bilbo lives in Bag End. Bilbo was born on the 22nd of September, third age 2890. Bilbo first appears in the first paragraph of the first chapter of The Hobbit. This sort of information can be presented in what's called a knowledge graph, where nodes representing people, places, dates and texts and more are linked to one another. If this reminds you a little of links between web pages, that's quite intentional. Linked open data is about combining concepts from knowledge graphs with concepts from the World Wide Web. Let's expand our graph a little. We've said what type of thing Bilbo is, but we haven't said what the other entities are types of. Here we've added more information to our graph, indicating that, for example, Bag End is a location, and that the 22nd of September 2890 is a date. We can continue to expand this with, for example, information about the relationship between locations, or between people. As you can imagine, knowledge graphs can grow to thousands or even millions of nodes and links. Before we get into what makes linked open data distinct, let's look at some more links that might extend from our Bilbo node. We've already seen that Bilbo first appears in the first paragraph of The Hobbit. We can say that letter 263 discusses that paragraph. We can then say things about the letter, such as who the sender and recipient were and when it was dated. We could continue to add information about the primary world places and dates. You could also add that same paragraph is discussed in a particular YouTube video by yours truly, or a podcast episode, or a blog post, or an academic paper. Some terminology. The basic unit in linked open data is the statement. A statement is made up of three things, hence the alternative name triple. The subject, predicate, and object. So in Bilbo lives in Bag End, the subject is the entity Bilbo, the predicate is the property lives in, and the object is the entity Bag End. The object can be another entity, but can also be a literal value. Imagine an info box on the Tolkien gateway where a property value may link to another article, like linking to the Bag End article, or it may not be a link at all if it's just something like a name or an age. Now, some issues may have occurred to you, and so I now want to explain how linked open data solves certain problems that one might encounter with knowledge graphs, especially if they're worked on by multiple independent groups and need to scale to large sizes. The focus on statements is one advantage of linked open data. There does not need to be a single source for everything about a particular entity. Statements can come from multiple sources. Perhaps one source states that Bilbo is a hobbit living in Bag End who was born on the 22nd of September 2890. Perhaps a completely different source is stating that Bilbo first appears in H01001, or that letter 163 mentions that paragraph. Yet another source may assert that the recipient of letter 163 was W.H. Auden. We'll say more in a moment about how that works. First, I want to point out that this sort of representation of linked open data is actually a simplification, because nodes are not really given an inherent name like this. Instead, names are just further statements that are made about nodes. There is an entity whose first name is Bilbo, but whose hobbitish last name is Labingi. He lives in a location whose English label is Bag End, but whose hobbitish label is Laberneck. He was born on a day whose year in Shy reckoning was 1290. So Gandalf can go by many names, and letters can have more than one identifier. But what then do we put in our statements for the subject, or the object if it isn't a literal value? What exactly has the northern name Gandalf, or the TCG number 476? If we were just building some local database, we could do something like just assign a number to each entity, and say entity number 1 has the names Gandalf, Mithrandir, Tharkun, and so on. But we want this to scale and allow multiple groups to build out parts of the knowledge graph. To solve this problem, linked open data uses identifiers that are globally unique, usually URLs, because it's easy for independent parties to mint them. Here are 3 different URLs representing Bilbo Baggins, for example, and one's representing the TCG letter 476 and the first paragraph of The Hobbit. The last URL represents J.R.R. Tolkien himself and is used by library catalogues around the world. Oh, and by the way, properties are URLs too. Here are 3 different URLs for the concept of a date of birth. There's a bit more to it, but these are the core concepts. Hopefully you have a better foundation now to further your understanding of linked open data and how it might apply to collaboratively building a Tolkien knowledge graph.